1952 symposium, Our Country and Our Culture, the editors of Partisan Review put to their contributors this question, among others: do you believe that a democratic society necessarily leads to a leveling of culture, to a mass culture which will overrun intellectual and aesthetic values traditional to Western civilization? The same question has been directed to the participants in the present symposium. Do you believe that a democratic society necessarily leads or has led to a leveling of culture? Whatever else may have changed in the last 30 years, the debate about mass culture stays the same. Recently revived in the form of a debate about narcissism, about the decline of educational excellence, and the cultural roots of America's declining position in the world market, the debate about mass culture remains mired in the old ruts because those who reject the critique of mass culture nevertheless accept its major premise. They too believe, as Peter Klikak puts it in his recent book, America's Quest for the Ideal Self, they too believe that high culture has lost much of its social authority, that authoritative standards of judgment are increasingly difficult to discover, that democracy brings a certain cheapening of opinion, a lowering of taste, lapses of civility, and that the bourgeois ideal of leisurely, gracious living has neither survived well among the very privileged nor spread throughout society. At the same time, defenders of mass culture agree with Herbert Gans that poor people are as entitled to their own culture as anyone else, and that intellectuals' efforts to impose high culture on other people violates those people's right to a culture, as Gans puts it, that relates to their own experience. Since both parties to this debate agree that modernization leads to the democratization of society and culture, the difference between them comes down to the issue of whether social and economic progress compensates for the dilution and vulgarization of high culture. These are the terms in which the issue was discussed in 1952, and these are still the terms in which it's discussed 30 years later. The 1952 symposium was full of speculation about the democratization of culture, about the debasement of culture, about the seeping down of culture to the masses, and the bohemianization of the outlands, about highbrows, middlebrows, and lowbrows. In reply to the critique of mass culture conducted by the editors of PR and by Irving Howe, Dwight MacDonald, another person conspicuous by his absence from that symposium, in reply to this critique, others, mostly sociologists, like Edward Shills and Herbert Gans, argued that mass culture, whatever its vulgarities, had made available to everybody an array of personal choices formerly restricted to the rich. The new society is a mass society, Shills wrote, precisely in the sense that the mass of the population has become incorporated into society. For the first time, the masses had emerged from their immemorially old, clod-like existence and achieved at least the possibility of becoming full members of their society, of living a human life with some exercise of cultural taste. Today, Klikak and others make the same point when they argue that the past was a better time only for certain elite groups. Most people in the past, they claim, led hard, unhappy lives. Industrialism has brought common people for the first time, Klikak's words, a vast expansion of possibilities for personal fulfillment. If they exploit these possibilities in ways that offend intellectuals, the important thing is that they have the right to choose. They enjoy a range of cultural options, formerly available only to aristocrats. The excesses deplored by conservative intellectuals and Tory radicals alike are the excesses of immaturity, according to this argument, and will give way in time to something better. In the form in which it's been conducted now for the last 30 years, the debate about what used to be called mass culture and now tends to be called narcissism can never be resolved. The debate has turned on the controlling conception of cultural change as a balance sheet in which material gains offset cultural losses. It turns on the question of whether material progress exacts too heavy a price in the loss of cultural excellence. But who's to say whether the gains of social and economic democracy outweigh its cultural side effects? That would depend largely, I would think, on temperament. But suppose the question is misconceived. What if we reject the premise behind this interminable discussion that industrialism fosters political and economic progress? What if we reject the equation of industrialism with democracy and start instead from the premise that large-scale industrial production undermines local institutions of self-government, weakens the party system, discourages popular initiative? In that case, cultural analysis can no longer content itself with balancing the social and political gains allegedly attendant on industrial progress against cultural losses. It'll have to decide instead whether the invasion of culture and personal life by the modern industrial system produces the same effects that it produces in the social and political realm: a loss of autonomy and popular control, a tendency to confuse self-determination with the exercise of consumer choices, a growing ascendance of educated elites and of a new professional managerial class, the replacement of practical skills with organized expertise. Modern technology and mass production have been defended, like mass culture, on the grounds that although they may take some of the charm out of life, they have added immeasurably to the comforts enjoyed by ordinary men and women. Gans writes, "I have no quarrel with tradition. I'm in favor of washing machines over washboards and over riverbanks, however. But it is precisely the democratizing effects of industrial technology that can no longer be taken so easily for granted. If technology, for example, reduces some of the drudgery of housekeeping, it also renders the housekeeper dependent on machinery, not merely the automatic washer and dryer, but the elaborate energy system required to run these and innumerable other appliances, the breakdown of which brings housekeeping to a halt. Industrial technology undermines the self-reliance and autonomy both of workers and of consumers. Our growing dependence on technologies nobody seems to understand or control has given rise to a widespread feeling of powerlessness and victimization. The consumer feels that he lives in a world that defies practical understanding and control, a world of giant bureaucracies, information overload, and complex interlocking technological systems vulnerable to sudden breakdown, like the giant power failure that blacked out the Northeast in 1965, or the meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1980. The dominant imagery associated with political protest in the 70s and 80s is not the imagery of personhood, as some optimists would have it, But the imagery of victimization and paranoia, of being manipulated, invaded, colonized, and inhabited by alien forces, that's also a recurrent theme in the science fiction that Mr. Fiedler was talking about a minute ago. I don't think any of this can really be captured by a formula like the democratization of culture. It's a rhetoric that simply doesn't engage at all with these developments. Even if we consider the problem of culture more narrowly as the dissemination of ideas, information, it seems to me we find a similar pattern, one that suggests, among other things, that mass culture ought to be considered more as a problem of technology than as a problem of standards and taste. Advanced technologies of communication, which seem merely to facilitate the dissemination of information on a wider scale than was possible before, prove on closer examination to impede the circulation of ideas and to concentrate control over information in a handful of giant organizations, some public, some private. Modern technology has something of the same effect on the dissemination of ideas that it has on the production of material goods, where it serves principally, whatever its incidental side benefits, principally to assert managerial control over the labor force. A close study of mass culture leads to the same conclusion. That's prompted by a study of the mechanization of the workplace. That is, that much advanced technology embodies by design, in both senses of the word, a one-way system of management and communication. It concentrates economic and political control, and increasingly cultural control as well, in a small elite of corporate planners, market analysts, social engineers, and intellectuals. It invites popular input or feedback only in the form of suggestion boxes, market surveys, and public opinion polls. Technology in this way comes to serve as an effective instrument of social control in its own right. In the case of the mass media, by short-circuiting the electoral process through opinion surveys that help to shape opinion instead of merely recording it, by reserving to the media themselves the right to select political leaders and spokesmen, and by presenting the choice of leaders and parties as a choice among consumer goods. Now, this interpretation of mass culture, if we insist on using that term at all, may be wrong, and there's certainly a lot to be said against it. But the point is that it's a different argument. I hope to persuade you of this much anyway. A different argument from the old accusation that mass culture lowers public taste, or from the Marxist version of this argument, according to which mass culture brainwashes the workers and keeps them in a state of false consciousness. It's not my position, as Herbert Gans tries to summarize it, that if commercial popular culture were eliminated, workers could and would become intellectuals. Why should workers become intellectuals? I can't imagine a less attractive prospect than a society made up of intellectuals. What is important is that workers have more control over their work. What's also important is to see that this question of control is not just a political or an economic question, but a cultural question as well. Since it seems to be impossible to talk about mass culture or popular culture without using terms like highbrow and lowbrow, it might be a good idea to trace these terms back to their source. when George Santayana and Van Wyck Brooks introduced them, the terms referred not to the contrast between high culture and popular culture, but to a different contrast between American material life, practical life, and the thin, imported literary culture superimposed on it, a culture which itself underwent rapid popularization, as Brooks pointed out in discussing the 19th century cultural dominance of New England over the whole American mind. Brooks's point was that American culture had no connection with, exercised no shaping discipline over practical life, serving instead only as ornamentation. He wasn't pleading, like his contemporary John Dewey, for the democratization of high culture, nor was he pleading, on the other hand, for an art that would celebrate the sweep and turmoil of American life. He was concerned with something more important, the bifurcation of work and play, of labor and leisure, of, as he put it, bare facts and metaphysics. In the tradition of William Morris, he was interested not in creating large numbers of enlightened consumers of culture, but in ending the segregation of art and achieving a new integration of art and everyday life. Brooks's early work, together with Lewis Mumford's studies in technology, which were conceived in much the same spirit and under the direct inspiration of Brooks, this work points to the conclusion that the degradation of culture grows hand in hand with the degradation of work, and also, of course, with the glorification of art. It isn't the case that art is an object of indifference in modern society. It comes closer to being an object of worship. It has come to enjoy the esteem formerly reserved for religion. The modernist tradition, which has been absorbed by the bourgeois public it condemns, deifies the artistic genius as a heroic rebel, iconoclast, pathbreaker. And it's this cult of genius and originality, among other things, that has led to the dead end of experimentation, the struggle for novelty, the predictable defiance of established forms and constraints, or their reimposition in the most stifling manner that characterize the arts today. Works of art deemed great, the more outrageous the better, have increasingly taken on the quality of collector's items, valued because they advertise the wealth and leisure necessary for their consumption, valued also because the taste for beauty and the instinct of workmanship no longer find satisfaction in the workplace and are therefore forced to seek other outlets. The deformation of the concepts of highbrow and lowbrow provides a modest illustration of the distance we have traveled, not in this case since 1952, but since 1915, when Brooks published America's Coming of Age. Those terms came out of an intellectual tradition devoted to the restoration of craftsmanship, the revival of the artistic dimension of practical activity, the unification of work and play. The debate about mass culture took shape in the 40s and 50s, precisely at the point when this program came to be regarded as the expression of a discredited utopianism. Having given up hope for a democratization of the working life people, intellectuals now turned their attention to the uses of leisure. But the sterility of the resulting debate about mass culture and high culture suggests that it might be a good idea to return to an earlier formulation of these issues, one that was in closer touch with the political and social concerns that originally gave rise to this whole line of speculation, one that does not confuse democracy with an endless proliferation of consumer goods, and does not confuse culture with the cult of great art and the prestige accorded to intellectuals as a class. Thank you.